This week, Lenny Zeltser from Exonius is with us to discuss the Defender's Advantage. Then Kirsten Davies from Institute for Cyber Civics joins us to talk about election security. Finally, we've got two interviews for you from Okta's annual Octane conference. In the first interview, Mandy Logan discusses security-focused company culture with Bhana Singh, Chief Technology Officer of Customer Identity Cloud at Okta. Then Mandy discusses the era of bot battlers with Charlotte Wiley, SVP and Deputy Chief Security Officer at Okta. All that and more on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly. Digital threats evolve rapidly, making it difficult for security teams to keep pace. Tying security automation and orchestration is different from traditional SOAR. It allows teams to move faster and make better decisions in real time. With Tynes, analysts and engineers have everything they need to automate the processes they're closest to, regardless of complexity. Built by security practitioners for security practitioners, Tynes powers mission-critical security workflows at McKesson, Canva, and Mars. Start building for free at securityweekly.com/Tynes. Graylog elevates enterprise-level cybersecurity through its comprehensive SIEM, centralized log management, and API security solutions. Built on the Graylog platform, Graylog Security combines SIEM, security analytics, threat detection, and incident response capabilities. Unlike traditional SIEMs, which offer complex and costly setups, Graylog Security simplifies security and operational challenges with an optimal blend of licensing, people, and infrastructure costs. To see a demo, visit securityweekly.com/Graylog. Welcome to Enterprise Security Weekly and happy National Food Day. Why not? Tomorrow can be National Air Day, National Day of Breathing Air. This is episode 381, recorded on Thursday, October 24th, 2024. I'm your host, Adrian Sanabria, and joining me is the Admiral of ASPM, the Captain of Content, Katie Teitler-Santullo. How you doing, Katie?
I am well. How are you, Adrian?
I'm good. Do you like eating food? I like eating food.
Yeah, you and I have had a few conversations about food. I've been gone for a couple of weeks, and one of the reasons I was on vacation, and I had some amazing food, believe it or not, in Norway. But I came back half fish. I came back, with gills, because I had fish at least once a day, sometimes 3 meals a day. So I will celebrate fish.
That tracks with my expectations. I've never been to Scandinavia, but I would expect to eat a lot of seafood, for sure.
Definitely. And it was beautiful. And I would highly recommend going back, but not working there.
Nice.
It's way too relaxing.
Nice. Well, we missed you. I think this is the first time we've had you on in 3 weeks or so.
Yeah.
Also joining me for the first time ever, our new co-host, Ayman Elsawa.
Hello, cheers. Thanks for having me on.
How you doing, Ayman?
I got my espresso here and we're good to go.
All right. Good to have you, Ayman. And you'll be seeing more of Ayman in the upcoming episodes, and we're excited to have him on board.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
All right. So National Food Day. We sometimes love these silly national days because they're uber specific. It'll be National Chocolate Pudding Day or something like that. But this one's silly because it's so vague. But it is an actual thing from the Center for Science in the Public Interest. They initiated a National Food Day. So moving into the topic for today, today's topic is turning the defender's dilemma into the defender's advantage. We're excited to have Lenny Zeltser with us today to discuss this. Lenny is the CISO at Exonius, has a rich history in the security field as a trainer, speaker, thought leader, and general educator. A lot of that through his website, which I've been reading forever, it feels like. And it's one of his blog posts that inspired having him on today as a guest. Welcome, Lenny.
Hi, it's good to be here.
Yeah, so this is something I think we've discussed a lot, but I haven't seen a lot of people actually blog about. I saw a bit of a rant from Fernando Montenegro on LinkedIn the other day, where he was. I don't know if you also saw that post, talking about the attacker only has to be right once, the defender has to be perfect. It has to get it right every time. And I think that grates on a lot of us. We still hear that a lot. And is that what also inspired you to write this post?
Yeah, exactly. I very frequently, just like you, hear this idea that the defender's position inherently has a disadvantage because presumably the attacker has to be right just once, while the defender presumably has to be right all the time to defend against all possible attacks across all possible attack vectors. And I believe that's not true, not accurate at all. In fact, when we prepare, we as defenders can gain quite an advantage over the attackers.
And I think part of why I love that you wrote this, and I suspect part of your goal in writing it is to get defenders to realize that they're leaving a lot on the table here, right? There's a lot of stuff you can do as a defender, but we focus so much on prevention, that even today, I feel like, building stuff right of boom, detection, response, all that kind of stuff. We've been hitting pretty hard. EDR came out over 10 years ago now, but still, deception and things like that. I feel like there's a lot of options that defenders don't deploy. A lot of techniques, a lot of tricks that they could use to either trip up attackers or just stop them completely.
Yeah, I think we oversimplify the attacker's perspective, in part because we typically have the position of a defender, and it's hard to get the mindset of the other side that we're battling when protecting our information assets. The attackers, from the perspective of one specific attacker, have to get a lot of things right to achieve their objective. And what that means is that we can understand the steps that the attackers need to go through to achieve their objective and interfere with them across those many steps. And that interference can take the form of detecting them because they will introduce some noise into the system or the network that we're monitoring, and we can block their attacks at so many different steps of the attack chain. When we think about how MITRE describes attackers' dynamics, they talk about the multiple steps involved in a typical attack path. And if we understand those steps, we can consider how do we, in advance, deploy the right detective or preventative technologies to interfere with those attack paths at multiple different stages.
So, I think one of the things where, oftentimes we can say this stuff at a high level, there's a lot that you can do here, but, from a process standpoint, how would you recommend people develop these kinds of techniques? There are things you can just buy off the shelf or do with what you already have, and how do you ensure that the stuff works and is going to be effective?
Yeah, I think we can start by thinking about this from the architecture perspective before we talk about technology itself. But even before we look at our world of IT, let's think about the physical world where the attackers and defenders have been fighting with each other since the dawn of humankind, I suppose. There are plenty of examples in history of kinetic warfare where the defenders had an advantage over the attacker when the attack occurred on their home turf. They gained that advantage by understanding the terrain that they presumably know better than the attacker. And if they understand their own terrain, then they can take actions to set up traps or to otherwise guide the attacker towards those areas where the defender has an advantage. For example, meet the attacker at a very narrow junction point, a narrow bridge, for example, where the defender will have some advantage of the attacker that has to cross a very narrow passage and thus expose themselves to attacks. So I think in the world of IT, we can take the time to understand our own environment and consider where can we introduce security measures so that the attacker has to go through those mechanisms that we have set up where we can defend our environment properly. One simple example of that, to avoid being overly abstract, is the introduction of single sign-on into the environment. If you have hundreds of independently managed SaaS applications, then that means that you have hundreds of applications that you need to defend individually, and that it is overwhelming and very expensive. But if instead you introduce single sign-on to access those applications, that means that you have a single choke point through which an attacker has to get to attack those SaaS applications. And now you can enforce security measures such as, for example, two-factor authentication or anomaly detection in a single spot, and thus reduce the effort that you put into defending yourself against all of the attack vectors. And that's just one example.
I think one of the things that you're well known for is your pragmatism and looking at things, really breaking it down and looking at it practically to overcome challenges. Whereas I think there's a certain segment of the industry that likes to be a little more inflammatory, a little more dramatic, perhaps. So how do we, everything you just mentioned, of course, it makes sense, it's logical, but how do we shift the mindset to start thinking less like victims and more like strong competitors?
I think one of the ways to do it is to stop being so preoccupied with the current attack trends. That's something that's hard for me to say because for a long time I've always tracked and been interested in understanding how the attackers pursuing their objectives today and how's that different from a year before and a year before. And it's fun to talk about. And you do need to understand how the attackers are proceeding and assess your own defenses against it. But I think we've been so preoccupied with keeping track of the latest attack trends and then looking at our defenses to see how do they measure up against those attacks. What if for a moment, just at least for this exercise, we say, forget the attackers for the moment. Let's exercise not an attack-oriented mindset, but a defense-oriented mindset. And let's look at what we have. And let's think about how do we fortify our environment against attacks, no matter what the attackers choose to do today or a year from now. So for example, I suggested look at your SaaS applications and put a project into place to enable single sign-on whenever practical. That's one example of a defense-oriented mindset because you are focusing on yourself and that's something that you can control rather than focusing on the attackers who are an entity that you do not control. Another example of this is to look at what you are defending and minimize your attack surface, perhaps by blocking access to certain parts of your infrastructure that does not need to be accessible from the outside, or turning off, disabling user accounts that have gone dormant, are not being used, but that could be abused, or assessing what software is provisioned within your environment, but is no longer used and disabling it or removing that software. Those are all examples of focusing on yourself first before you focus on others. And by focusing on yourself, it's something that you control. It's something that I feel is less stressful, that I think allows you to gain that defender's advantage that I have been talking about.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And when I'm talking about this subject, liken it to practicing for sports teams, right? Because you have offenders and you have defenders. And when you're on defense, yes, you have to know your team, your opposition as much as you can. But what you're really doing in your practices, in your drills, in your scrimmages is focusing on how do I cover the field better? How do I block and tackle better? How do I get in front of the ball more? How do I create an open position for myself to be useful? And so I think that's great advice. Yours, not mine, just to be clear.
Well, I appreciate any examples that are relevant to information security that are not military-based, because we tend to be very, perhaps overly militaristic when we talk about, cybersecurity. So I think talking about sports is a great way of describing similar dynamics without getting too gory into military details, perhaps.
Oh, yeah. So Lenny, thanks for the article. I think the article was really good and well thought out. I want to hone in on the part where you mentioned remediate in a measured way. I really like that because sometimes as practitioners, we're trying to, boil the ocean or fix things. Can you expand on that and, talk maybe sometimes where it went wrong? We're trying to fix something and it went the wrong way.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I can generalize, but I can speak about myself. I am often impatient, and I have to remind myself that doing difficult things requires time. And what that means is that I can, in our context, review my environment, identify a variety of gaps. Maybe I've got a lot of applications that are not being managed properly. Maybe I have too many networks that have too much infrastructure accessible from the outside. Maybe I've got poor practices related to onboarding and offboarding employees and granting them the appropriate access. Like, there's a lot of gaps that you can identify by focusing on yourself and doing even a self-assessment. It can feel overwhelming because you want to tackle it all at once because you're nervous about all of this. But it takes time. And what that means is that you need to allow yourself to work on these projects over a period of time. And of course, you're going to tackle something first. And so you need to prioritize. Where do you see the biggest risk? Although where you see the biggest risk is not necessarily what you should tackle first, not all the time, because where you see the biggest risk, maybe that project is so expensive, so burdensome, that maybe you start off with something a bit easier to get your muscles going like you would warm up before a workout, for example. But yeah, balance out the biggest risks that you've identified with the areas that your current capabilities allow you to tackle, and do this in a measured way, prioritizing every step project by project. And know that in an environment that has not been exercising what I will term the defense focused mindset, it'll take several years to get to a point where you're no longer stressed out about your attack surface, about the state of your environment. It'll take several years. That means having a long view over the projects that you will work on and prioritizing them year after year, month after month.
Yeah. And it's important to take the small wins. Even small wins are helpful, and showcasing them, as I'm sure. Like, so, just as you mentioned with the reward and having patience, if we could showcase even the small wins and let other people know, hey, we did this thing in the background, because the job of the defender is hard. If nothing goes wrong, what are you doing? If something goes wrong, what are you doing? So
yeah, and one example of what could be a small but celebratable win, if that's a word, is finding unused applications that your company is paying for that expose you to unnecessary risk, right? Because every time there's an application that no one's using, it's an area that could be attacked, and yet you don't derive any business benefit from having that software around. So if you go on a hunt, going on a hunt sounds too fancy. Just look around. What software is deployed? I'm talking typically about SaaS products that are probably in your environment, and see who's using them. When was the last time people logged into them? And see if any of these products overlap with others. And find an application, a single one, that you can disable, that you can decommission. Now, this will be a win because not only do you improve your security posture by minimizing your attack surface, but also you're saving company money. And everybody likes that. So now you're a hero who saved, I don't know, $30,000. Now you're a hero because you now no longer have that thing that could be attacked. And now you're building up your muscle of working within the organization to decommission these applications, because oftentimes as a security leader, you're not controlling the decision of whether to use a certain app or not. That means talking to other people. That means getting them on board. That means building up goodwill with them. And so it takes time. And so start small with something that provides meaningful impact, that is not too overwhelming, and then continue month after month, year after year.
You touched on something there that I want to hone in on a little bit, because you're talking about being patient. You're talking about this all taking time, which of course it does. How do you balance that when you're the CISO or VP of security and you're talking to your executive team who is very anxious to make sure security isn't slowing down the business? You gave some small examples, but what happens when they come, and I've heard this from a lot of people, the executive team or the board comes and says, are we like X company who's in the news? Is this going to happen to us after they've read the Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg or New York Times? How do you counter that when you're really focused on long-term efficacy, and small wins might seem too small for the board of directors?
Look, it takes time to build up that credibility. And that's one of the reasons why I suggested finding some early wins. Imagine you're a new security leader. They hired you because they have high expectations, and they might give you a few months worth of time to kind of prove yourself. Everybody recognizes that you need at least a few months to do something meaningful. So you need to deliver something. Find those early wins and show the organization, show your manager, show your board of directors that you can do it, that here are specific improvements that you've already introduced, but then do so in the context of telling a story about how you have a plan, a 3-year plan, for example, or a 5-year plan. I'm not sure, whatever makes sense in your context. That they hired a security leader, presumably because there's a strategic need, and strategic need means dealing with fires and tactical issues that come up, but ultimately, as a leader, as a security executive, you're there to execute on a longer term vision, and hopefully you come into an organization that recognizes that, and it's an exercise in persuasion and building trust, and that has nothing to do with technology, really. It's about human relations and showing that you're valuable and that you're delivering what you said on what you said you're going to deliver.
Yeah, it's something else, that I've played around with, be interesting to get your thoughts on it since you've done some malware analysis in your past, Lenny. I don't know if you're still actively doing that, but I used to do a workshop that was about just protecting Windows with Windows. And the concept was you could take, your average ransomware, whatever malware you're afraid of, and by changing a few things to Windows that, have absolutely no impact on your employees or your processes or anything, you can break that because of the idea that the attacker is coming in blind. So they have to make some assumptions about your environment, about, where things are installed. If it's you put the Windows directory in a different drive other than C, all of a sudden a lot of things break. Or, if you change some default variables to different values, all of a sudden things break because attackers, they go for the the easiest win. They're not spending a bunch of time making malware resilient, right? Or even their attack plans at a higher level. So I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think inherently the advantage that we as defenders have over our attackers is that we should know our environment better than they do. And there are always exceptions, unfortunately, to this.
That hurts me, that statement.
But it's achievable. What I'm saying is very much achievable. You just need to take the time to get the lay of the land of your own organization. It takes effort for sure. And in the case of malware, that applies as well. The attacker who's crafting a malicious program needs to create that program in advance and then unleash it into the field. Now, yes, it's possible to write software that makes decisions on the fly, that is modular, that assesses its own environment and then acts accordingly. And perhaps once artificial intelligence becomes available to malware on a larger scale, the software will be more autonomous and more resilient. But today, malware has very well-defined logic configured into it in advance. And if something goes wrong across that infection path, the malware no longer functions as it should be. That's an example of where the defenders have an advantage because we know our environment presumably better than the attackers. And so we can introduce aspects into our environment that make a lot of malware just break. For example, malware might assume that it can interact with certain tools locally, and if you change your configuration so that those tools are not available, it'll oftentimes fail. There's always examples of how attackers can craft their malicious software to be more resilient, to be more advanced. But in many cases, attackers, as you pointed out, look for a way to achieve their objective in the easiest way possible. And therefore, we can create our environment so that automated tools are less likely to work. This increases the cost for the attacker because now they need to introduce tools that are more advanced, more sophisticated, more resilient. Increasing the costs of our adversary is very much an example of using our knowledge of our environment to our advantage and putting the attacker at a disadvantage.
Yeah. So before we wrap up here, it sounds like, I heard you mentioning look for an easy win, right? Don't put yourself on too long of a runway when doing this. And also a lot of focusing on yourself. It sounds like, focusing on like one of the things I thought of, I was on an advisory call. I'm IANS faculty with an IANS client. And we were just looking through their vulnerability scans. They needed help with vulnerability management. I noticed all their web servers had cups installed, because the default Red Hat Enterprise Linux has a bunch of stuff not only installed, but services running by default. And it just strikes me like how much of those defaults, you're talking about removing programs and saving money, but this is more like, I don't know, that really struck me. I started thinking, is everybody really out there running web servers with printing services installed?
Apparently plenty of people do, but that's a great example of forgetting for the moment what the attackers are doing. Are they exploiting cups, or are they exploiting some other service on a given day? And instead, in advance, looking at the configuration of your servers and saying, let me just turn off things that I don't need. It's going to allow the server to function as well, if not better. And now, no matter what the attackers are trying to exploit, the chances that they will encounter an exploitable service on the system are decreased. And so now you've taken the advantage that the attacker presumably has and taken the gain to yourself by being a little bit proactive and reducing the attack surface. And by the way, something I wanted to mention, Adrian, you said look at the early wins. Think about the short term. I wanted to make sure that people understand that early wins are important, but I want to make sure we are not too short-sighted. Achieving a defensible program, gaining a full advantage of the attackers, it takes time. So yes, let's focus on the short-term tactical objectives and get the early wins to get support for the program and for our projects. But it takes time. You need to have a longer-term mindset and expect that if you join the company, you hopefully will stick around for at least 3 years, because it takes that long to introduce meaningful changes into an environment that perhaps hasn't been managed with security in mind for a long time.
And just one last question before we wrap the conversation here. One of the things I've observed is a lot of IT teams, especially, maybe less so the security folks, there's this kind of fear of any change, especially when things are working, things are running, so just take cups off all your production web servers. I can see a lot of people saying, but what if somebody's using it? What if that causes some kind of disruption? Because in their mind, reducing attack surface is kind of a nice to have, but disrupting production is absolutely never to be done.
It's a valid perspective. It's a valid perspective from organizations that are on the hook for keeping the environment up and running. And the less change you introduce, the lower the chances that something will break. And what I'm saying is you need to introduce change to reduce the attack surface, for example. And that's why this is hard. If it was easy, we would have been done by now. It's hard. It's hard to gain that trust. It's hard to build that camaraderie with your colleagues to say, we need to introduce some change. Because if we don't change how we manage our infrastructure, how we oversee our SaaS applications, how we secure our environment, if we don't change that, then we will always feel like we're playing catch up with the attackers. We will always find ourselves reacting to what the attackers are exploiting on any given day and giving them the opportunity to drive the terms of our engagement. And you can never keep up. And that's why you will keep asking for more and more money and see not a lot of benefits from the funding that you're spending on security if that is how you're always reacting. So you need to get buy-in from your colleagues and your management to put effort and take on some risk to introduce change that in the long term will benefit the company and allow it to have a more stable and more secure environment.
All right, good stuff. Lenny, thank you so much for joining us today. Was so happy that we got to have this conversation on this particular topic today.
Glad we did it. Thank you for having me.
And for those listening, we did link the blog post in the show notes, or you can just go to zeltser.com. It's just Lenny's last name.com. And I think it's like just a couple blog posts ago, so it's probably pretty high up in the list there. All right. Stay tuned. When we come back, we're going to cover a very timely topic. We're talking about election security with Kirsten Davies from the Institute for Cyber Civics.